We are continuing in today's Mishna Yomi in Perek Aleph Mishna Vav, the last Mishnah in the first chapter of Peah, Mishnah number 6, and we will begin in Meretz Hashem, the second chapter of Meseches Peah as well. So Mishnah Vav reads as follows: The Olam hu nosim mishum Peah upater min ha'maisros. So a very simple halacha, that is, anything that is designated as Peah is essentially exempt from Meiser. The logic behind that is that since Peah itself is a tzedakah, right? Since Peah is a form of charitable contribution, so it makes sense that Peah will be exempt from other tithes. However, the Mishnah says that's ad she'im areach. That is true until the grain is smoothed out. Now, in general, the halacha is that grain does not become subject to the various tithes, the trumos and maestros, until we'll call it that the grain is complete. When is the grain considered to be complete? Well, not only simply after it's harvested, but after it's been piled and the pile of grain has been smoothed out. That represents the completion of the process of creating the grain, at which point in time it becomes subject to trumos and maestros. The nosein mishum hefker. Now, same idea, that if, let's say, a balabais, let's say a landowner, makes his field hefker, he makes his produce hefker, pater min ha'maisros. Remember, again, anything that is ownerless is also exempt from trumos and maisros, from tithes. Makes sense. In other words, the obligation of tithing is upon an individual owner. If no one owns the produce, then technically speaking, it is exempt. Ad she'im areach. Ultimately, again, however, once the pile is smoothed out, so remember again, here's what's interesting. Once the pile is smoothed out, the obligation for trumas and maisros is already devolved upon the grain. At that point in time, even if the owner were to subsequently go ahead and make it hefker, make it ownerless, halacha lamaisa, the tithing obligation would still remain upon the grain. Umachil labehema lachayv la'avosu patim and ha'maisros. Similarly, again, one could feed his animals. Literally, again, chayim means behemoths, domestic animals, dechaya, non-domesticated animals, birds, and ultimately, again, that which you feed the animals will be exempt from trumas and maisros, from tithing. Ad she'im areach. Again, until one goes in and smooths out the pile. So you begin to see the theme here, that halacha l'maisa, as long as the grain has not yet been smoothed out in the pile, the obligations for trumas and maisros has not yet been triggered. V'notel min hagoren. Similarly, again, one could go ahead and take wheat seeds from the wheat, v'zorea upatim min ha'maisros, and one could plant them, and ultimately, again, the growth will be pater from tithing, ad she'im areach, until ultimately the wheat is piled, and then halacha l'maisa, is obligated in tithes. So again, the idea over here is a little bit different. This is saying if I have wheat, I harvest the wheat, I want to take seeds from the wheat, kernels, and replant them. So can I replant them without having first tithed them? So Rabbi Akiva says yes, as long as the grain has not yet been piled and the pile has not yet been smoothed out. Kohen v'Levi shalakhu es hagoren. Similarly, again, if you have a Kohen and Levi who took their grain, they took grain, let's say again, from the threshing floor. Now this is before the grain has been fully processed, before it's finished. Ha'maisros shalahem. Ultimately, again, they're allowed to keep. So remember, at this point in time, if they take it from the threshing floor, that means trumas and maisros have not yet been separated. So the Kohen and Levi kind of took the grain in an earlier stage. They're permitted to keep the tithes. Ad she'im areach. However, again, once halacha l'maisa, the produce has been piled and the pile has been smoothed out, then the Kohen and Levi, even if they took the grain, would not automatically be entitled to keep the tithes themselves. So again, you see the theme of makdish upoda. If one goes ahead and consecrates his grain before the grain has been fully processed, upoda osa, and then he redeems it, chayiv b'maisros. Ultimately, again, once he redeems it, it is then obligated in tithes, ad she'im areach hagizbar, until, of course, the gizbar, who is the temple treasurer, goes ahead and piles it and smooths out the pile. Meaning that halacha l'maisa is a different halacha. Any produce owned by the Beis Hamikdash is automatically exempt from trumas and maisros. So the idea over here is, if at the time of the smoothing of the pile, the produce belonged to the Beis Hamikdash, then by definition it is truma and meiser exempt. And even if you were to redeem it afterwards, there would be no tithing obligation. So again, the common theme that one sees throughout this Mishnah is that halacha l'maisa, the tithing obligation on grain, really devolves upon the grain at the time the grain is quote-unquote finished. is finished. And when is it considered to be finished? At the time that it's piled and the pile is smooth. So again, we saw the various ramifications for that. The other piece for Peah is that halacha lamaisa, Peah will be exempt from tithes, trumas and maasros, unless, of course, you have already piled and smoothed the grain, not yet given away the Peah, at which point in time then even Peah would become subject to tithing obligations. Mazel tov, that is the end of Perek Aleph. We now continue with Perek Beis, the second chapter in Maseches Peah. So this is an interesting idea. The Mishnah here, just by word of introduction, the Mishnah explains that, remember, the halach is you have to leave a corner of the field for every field you have. Let's say a person has 2 fields, so halach l'maisi, you can't leave one corner for 2 fields. Rather, in 2 fields, each field will need to get its own corner. The Mishnah is going to discuss interesting cases over here about things that could divide a field and make one field into 2 fields. The ramification of that is, if it's 2 fields, each individual field will require its own Peah, its own corner. The following are things that could go ahead and divide up a field for Peah purposes. Hanachal, number 1, a stream. If a stream runs through a field, runs totally through a field, that divides the field into 2. Each field will therefore need its own corner, its own Peah. Hashlulis, a channel of water. Derech hayacha derech harabim, a path that is used by individuals, or a path that is used ultimately, again, by the rabbim. Now, the truth is, the Bartanura explains that what this means is derech hayacha, the individual path, means a path that is only 4 amas wide, right, which is 6 feet, versus derech harabim, which is a public path, is 16 amos wide. So again, either types of those paths will divide the field into 2, thereby requiring each field to go ahead and have its own Peah. Ushvil harabim, ushvil hayachid, hakavua b'mosachal mosag. Similarly, again, if the field has either a private pathway or a public pathway that is used, that is established both during the summer and the winter. V'habor, bor in this case is a field that is not worked, right? A fallow field. Now, what this is talking about over here is a situation where, let's say again, you have in the middle of the fields an area, right? An area that is uncultivated. So that area that is uncultivated will divide the 2 adjoining fields into 2 separate fields, thereby each of them requiring their own Peah. V'hanir, similarly again, this is a field that has been plowed but has not yet been planted. And he goes on, he says, Zera mimin acher. So this is a situation ultimately again. So bor and nir are really their case number 6, which is a field that is not mu'bedes. It's not worked. It's not plowed. Nir is a field that's been plowed but has not yet been planted. So again, if you can imagine, if you were to have either an unworked patch or a patch that was plowed but not seeded, that could divide between the 2 adjoining parcels, making the 2 adjoining parcels into 2 separate fields, each of them requiring their own Peah obligation. Next, Zera Acher. The case of Zera Acher is a case of a field that is planted with a different kind of growth. Let's say, for example, you have a field, one big field. In the middle of that, so let's say in the big field you plant grain. In the middle of that field, you plant cucumbers, for argument's sake, leaving aside any kilayim issues. You plant cucumbers, so the fact that you have a patch that runs across the length of the field with a different item being produced there, being grown there, divides the 2 other fields into 2 separate fields, each of them requiring their own Peah. So again, the Mishnah says in all of these cases, halacha l'maisa, these are all examples of things that could divide one parcel into 2 independent fields and requiring a separate Peah obligation for each of those fields. He goes on, he says, v'hakotzer lashachas. So this is an interesting case. If one cuts down grain, right? This is talking about one cuts grain in the middle of a field. Now, lashachas means you're cutting down immature grain. So the grain has not yet matured. You're cutting it down in the middle of the field. Mafsik, div Rabbi Meir. Meir says this creates an interruption. This is a hefsik. So, for example, what this talking about is as follows. You have a grain field. In the middle of that grain field, you harvest a swath of immature grain. So now one field is divided into 2 parts, and in the middle of those 2 parts is the grain that was harvested when it was still before it reached maturity. Rabbi Meir says that will make that one field into 2 fields, and again, each of them requiring their own Peah portion. The Chum say, no, that's not true. that's not true. That halacha l'maisa, again, the fact that you harvested immature wheat will not go ahead and render the fields into two different fields. Ela imkein charash. Unless, of course, if you went ahead and you cut down the immature wheat and then you plowed the area, that would go ahead and make the two sides of the field into two independent fields, each of them requiring their own Peah obligation. Wonderful. We will stop over here for today. Meretz Hashem, we will continue tomorrow in Perek Beis, Mishnah is Beis through Gimel. Wishing everyone a wonderful day.